Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Mark Curphey. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to chat with you and dive into a lot of topics we have lined up. But before we do, for folks that don't know you, haven't come across you in the industry in any shape or form, can you tell us a bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So originally the UK, spent some time at Internet Security Systems, moved over to the US in 2000. Most people probably know the name from OWASP, where I was the founder of OWASP in the early 2000s. But I've done, was at Foundstone for a little bit of time. So spent kind of a lot of time on the operating side. I also ran a big part of the developer tools at Microsoft. So I think with MSDN and TechNet, a lot of people are familiar with it. The old CD coffee coasters, as they used to say, like the way to distribute software. But recent times did a startup called SourceClear, which was the first pure play SCA company that was acquired by Veracode in 2018. Recently a data classification company called OpenRaven, but came to the conclusion that AppSec was in my DNA. And so John Viega and I, John wrote the first ever book on developer security back in early 2000s and wrote one of the first static analysis tools. So John and I have co-founded a new company called Crash Override, which is very early stages. We're really just figuring out what to do. But yeah, so that's the brief history, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. You're definitely an industry pioneer and have been around for quite a while and seen a lot of evolution in the industry, which we'll be touching on coming up here in a moment. So you talked about SCA, but I wanted to start off first. You also authored an article recently titled, the SBOM Frenzy is premature. I want to dive into that a little bit with you before we move to SCA and OWASP and so on. I guess for folks not familiar, what is an SBOM before we dive into why the frenzy is premature?
Yeah, sure.
What is an SBOM and why the frenzy? What's leading to this frenzy?
Yeah, sure. So look, so an SBOM, a software bill of materials, right? And like that should already be the first warning, right? A bill of materials, like that's a manufacturing term, right? Like, we're not building airplanes, right? Like it's not the same. Like you don't take a whole set of parts and create a plane, like for many reasons. Like one is if I take the same piece of ingredient and give it to you and you create a piece of software, you'll get a different SBOM, right? So like that's one of the fundamental problems. The second one is like, again, it's not like a plane, like midair, we're changing things. Like I'm going from 2 to 3 wings midair. Like that doesn't happen in the materials world of old school engineering. So, it's a useful thing, of course, to know what's inside of your software. But it also it's become this silver bullet. Like, the government is now pushing to have an SBOM and everything. And there are so many both technical problems that are wrong with it. Like I said, you can have fundamentally, I can produce an SBOM that has nothing to do with what was in the software. Like there's no way to tie the two things together. So it's kind of like me rocking up to someone, to a health insurance and saying, here's my clean bill of health. Like who did it? Like, I don't know. Was it a legitimate doctor or was it me that produced my own clean bill of health? And that's the reality. So a lot of people are just brushing this under the carpet. And then, fundamentally, it doesn't also solve a bunch of other problems. So like, just because I know that that's what I've got, like I have to go do something with it. Things like CVE is fundamentally broken. And so, it's like, it's this thing that has potential to be very, very useful, but it's not there yet. And a lot of people are kind of assuming that it is already there and they're brushing aside all of these things that are fundamentally and like pretending they don't exist. And unless we solve those problems, like, this whole frenzy, like I said, it's just premature.
Yeah, I want to dive into some of the certain things you called out. But before you did that, you mentioned like the manufacturing parallel, right? With aircraft, for example. We've seen this kind of like take hold with the software factory reference architecture that's kind of come out from groups like Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And obviously, the age of Agile and DevOps. And like we hear a lot of parallels between Deming and Toyota lean principles and all that. Why do you think there's that people tend to tie manufacturing to what we're doing with software? What's driving that, do you think?
I don't know. I was going to say a lack of understanding, but that may be a little bit disrespectful. But like, I don't know. Like a lot of these things are not driven by engineers, and really when you look up. So, but again, like the SBOM thing has huge potential. Don't get me wrong. Like a lot of the stuff that's working in CycloneDX and those guys are absolutely fantastic. But for the government to say you got to attach an SBOM into everything, and then all of a sudden, like thinking that people know what's inside of the software and they get a clean bill of health, like it just doesn't make sense. So a lot of that stuff is driven by top-down people. It's like someone in the government thought this was going to be a great idea, and it hasn't necessarily been thought through, right? Around is it? And a lot of these like maybe good ideas, but are they the best thing? Are they going to have the biggest impact? Like, I don't think they are at this point, right? Like fundamentally trying to figure out how to fix the supply chain is just telling you what's in the end piece of software is probably not the most important thing, right? Like, you know.
Yeah, we have a weird situation where typically, you know, regulation and policy and government tends to lag technology, but it feels like in this case, SBOM, they're out ahead of where industry is in terms of tooling and technology in some sense. So it's a really interesting paradigm. You talked about in your article, like, you know, how you could have two different build machines, right, producing different SBOMs. And we know that, you know, common build environments have ephemeral or dynamic, you know, underlying hosts and so on. Can you discuss, you know, why that leads to a different SBOM or what the challenge is there?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I can produce an SBOM that has whatever it wants in for you. Like, literally. Like, honestly, you want an SBOM, like, send me an email, I'll produce you a clean SBOM. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, right? But the problem is, so most package managers are non-deterministic, meaning, so they do a lot of very complex things, right? Like, they will look, you know, typically you have a couple of choices when you define what dependency you want. You can pin a dependency, so you can say, I only want this version of that dependency. That has one fundamental problem in that, you know, if it doesn't get updated automatically, you only get that version. When a vulnerability comes up, it's very hard to get developers to update them. So it has one advantage that, you know, you're going to get the same thing. But the disadvantage is most developers won't update libraries because they think they're going to get broken. Other ways you can do it are you can just say, like, give me the latest. You can say, give me one that's after this version, or give me one that's within this range. The package manager will run through a lot of complex, you know, algorithms to figure out, like, okay, you have one locally, so I'm going to use that. It's this version, it matches the one inside this range. And so you may have a vulnerability in a library that says, I don't know, version 1.1, but the package manager has said anything between 1.0 and 1.2 is satisfactory. And so it won't go for 1.2, even though it's clean, it'll just satisfy the one that's locally. So if you run a build on your machine and I run a build on my machine, it depends on the environment as to what the output will be. And so you can get two different outputs, and one may say you're clean of vulnerabilities, and the other one may say you're not clean of vulnerabilities, but you basically put the same input into it, and you get a different output from a security context. So very problematic. There are ways that you can do it, but no one really does. Like, you can have a very clean build environment, which is exactly the same. You can push it through. There are package managers. Bazel from Google is one, but we're lacking. We're way behind on that. And so again, and that's a reality that, like, people are just ignoring. They're pretending that doesn't exist. So again,
I was going to ask you, like, you know, in the kind of construct where we have policy coming out, and policy takes this kind of broad, high level, you know, wide aperture to the problem, and it doesn't get to the nuance of some of the things you're talking about. But there are some frameworks like SALSA and SSDF, you know, that have higher maturity levels and talk about things like hermetic builds or reproducible builds. Do you think that those help solve some of these issues? And then also, I imagine those aren't practical for most organizations. It takes a lot of, you know, time, energy, and resources to, you know, operate in that kind of a construct.
Yeah. Again, so, you know, all of these things rise the tide, right? And so, like, you know, why would you not, you know, if it rises the tide, it's like great. So with SALSA, like, incredibly competent team, like, they all came out of Google and, like, super smart people. But that project kind of worked very well inside of Google, right? Where, you know, what you're essentially doing is signing an artifact. Well, at Google, they reviewed every single artifact before it went in. On NPM, there's 1.2 million libraries. Like, no one goes and looks at it. So it's the letterbomb problem, right? Like, Bruce Schneier used to say this back in the day about Windows. And if you look at a lot of the malware attacks, for example, it's signed drivers. Like, they sign a driver so they get access to the Windows kernel. Well, it's the same thing. Like, if I just sign a malicious package, like, I just got a malicious package, and when the letterbomb goes off, all I know who sent it. Like, it doesn't stop the bomb, right? So, like, great, Chris sent me a letterbomb, but like shit, like, the bomb's gone off and all the damage has been done. So, you know, those systems again work really well if what you're signing is clean. You know that you're only going to use something clean through the system. But a lot of people can't do that, and it creates a huge amount of friction. And so I think what you're seeing, or what you're likely to see, is, like, the people that will benefit from that stuff the most won't be able to do it. The people that benefit the least are already the sophisticated ones who will do it. You know, the hope is that stuff eventually gets baked into the infrastructure. But again, that problem only really sees a big impact when we have clean things that can get put into the pipe in the first place. And no one's tackling, or people are trying to tackle that problem, but they're not really making an impact. So, you know, it's a yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, it's great that those things are being developed, and they will be great, but then they're not silver bullets, right?
Yeah, I think you're pointing out that, like, these things help, but we have a long way to go, and also there's no one single thing. There's no panacea, like you mentioned. Like signing, for example, is a great best practice and a recommendation, but if you're signing something malicious, all you've done is sign something that's poisonous, basically. So I wanted to
the whole NPM thing. If you think about all the packages that are upstream, like if NPM goes and enforces people to go sign packages, all the packages that are upstream, like most of the developers don't care. Like you can go buy an NPM account with a following, like on the dark web for not much money, and just because it's signed, like I've hijacked Chris's account, like Chris signs a library and you think it's a legitimate follower. Like none of those problems are solved. Whereas in the mobile app world, like Google's Play Store and Apple Store have built technology that goes and scans the apps before they get pushed into the store, right? So they've invested in that stuff, but in the package distribution systems, that just doesn't exist. And so it's not getting done, right?
Yeah. So I want to ask, moving away from SBOM a little bit, you also had an article as a follow-up talking about why SCA, or software composition analysis, is really hard. Can you lay out some of the reasons on, kind of what you touched on in that article, why it's so hard?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like it's the same SBOM problems that we've just talked about, right? Like, again, like what are you checking? You're doing constant builds all the time. So like, does stuff go and change? And ultimately, you got to compare it against a vulnerability database. And so CVE is fundamentally broken. Like so like one of the things that we learned about in SourceClear very early on, and frankly, one of the reasons why Verico purchased us at the time was that we built the same technology that figured out, is this vulnerable part of this vulnerable library actually being used? And it turned out that I think it was 98%. I don't know. We can go back and check the stats, but like 98% of the time you had a vulnerable Java library, the vulnerability piece was never being used. So 98% false positive rate, right? Like that's freaking ridiculous. And the CVE system, it's so like most people, and even today, like a lot of the SCA tools, all they're doing is grepping and going, oh, you've got this library, it's within this range, therefore you've got a problem. Like it's frankly bullshit. It's like you don't have a problem. You only have a problem if you're using the vulnerable part of the vulnerable library and using it in a vulnerable way. So a lot of the times, like even that is not accurate enough. And so, there's no faster way to piss developers off than basically tell them like you've got a problem and they know it's not a problem. And so SCA is really hard from that perspective. Also, what you look up, like the majority of CVE data is incomplete. It doesn't tell you what the vulnerable part is. So again, like I had to staff up a really expensive team of security researchers to pull apart every CVE and say, okay, like where's the vulnerable part, or is this even is this even the correct library? Like a lot of the time, it's actually even not the correct library. Like, I remember one that was it said, oh, it's Spring. It turned out it was the XML parser Xerces that Spring used. So like the implications of that are pretty big, right? Like it doesn't matter if I'm using Spring, it's if I'm using the Xerces parser. And then, oh, by the way, what other projects use the Xerces parser that could be vulnerable that no one said? So we had, I think it's public, but I guess it is now. So I had a contract through In-Q-Tel, which is the funding part of the US intelligence agencies, to figure out actually how many vulnerabilities were there. And at the time, we estimated it was about 250,000, where there were 6,000 CVEs. So like, again, like you're comparing it and going, great, I've got these amount of issues, but like you don't even know that all of those are the issues. And if you do it in a really crude way, you're basically saying 98% of them are false positive. So it's a really hard problem to go figure out how to solve. But an easy one to go put window dressing on, right?
Yeah, I think you use the term window dressing. I hate to use the term security theater, but it feels like we're just doing a lot of security theater. And when you start to think about how many organizations, resources, and vulnerability management, both on the security and development side, are tasked on chasing down these CVEs and CVSS severities and on and on. Like you talk about an incalculable amount of man hours and money that's spent on doing these activities.
Totally. Look at Log4j. It was just an absolute farce, right? Like people were going out trying to chase the thing. Like an awful lot of software projects will create a test directory, and inside there they'll put Log4j. It's never used. So all of a sudden everyone's out going, oh, we've got it here, we've got it there. It's like, oh, it's shipped in some test directory which is never used in production, or it was pushed onto a container that I pulled down from Docker and it was just in some directory that says never used. Like, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. You talked about CVEs, and we know that that's tied to obviously NVD and things like that. There's some emerging vulnerability databases like OSV or like the Global Security Database, being run by some folks at Cloud Security Alliance. Any thoughts on those other databases, if they may help, if they're a little bit better than what we're doing with NVD at the time, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, so for sure, like I think very highly of OSV. Like they're tackling. I mean, first of all, Google's got a huge amount of resource, so they can go and apply it very well. And they've designed it in a way that it's distributed, so you can go run your own local vulnerability database. And it turns out that's really important because, again, like the vast majority of vulnerabilities in open source libraries never get reported. They certainly never get reported to the CVE system. So if you go track, what we did at SourceClear again is that we built this technology that would like look at the Git commits of a particular library, and you would often see like, fixing this security issue. So it's like, they weren't like hiding it. Other times they would, but you could see what had changed. And so a lot of the vendors, like we used to do it, Sneak and all these other guys do it, is like they've got a bunch of vulnerabilities that don't have CVEs. So it causes a double-edged sword, right? Like, you don't use them, you don't know about it. In some cases, you do know about the vulnerability, but there's no fix. So like that causes another kind of problem. So what you've got is, basically a world where you have private vulnerabilities in each of these vendors. You have, public vulnerabilities, which may be reported inside of, CVE, and then you've got various qualities of them. So that whole problem needs to get fixed. I think OSV is a great initiative, and Google can put a lot of money behind it. Linux Foundation are funding some of it as well. And it's got an architecture that allows you to have those private vulns and public vulns, but ultimately, like, you've still got to pay to have the entire ecosystem. Otherwise, you're just relying on what's public. But that's definitely great work. It's a little disappointing, frankly, that Cloud Security Alliance and Google are going and doing the thing. I think if you could pool your resources, but maybe that's idealistic. And then I think the other thing that it's not tackling right now is that we've got to figure out how to have specialized vulnerability databases. So let's take the open source library one. You need to encapsulate the information about the vulnerable library. You need to be able to see the commits and what changed. And all that needs to get encapsulated so that the person that's fixing it or automated tools can actually do it. Now, that information may be different for IoT devices. It may be different for operating systems. It may be different for browsers. It may be different for blockchains and smart contracts or whatever it is. So at some point, like, I think we're going to have to split that as well into specialized and distributed vulnerability databases. But yeah, anything's better than CVE. So like, whatever.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, like, as you were walking through that, you were talking about some organizations like Google and others who have a massive amount of financial resources to put behind something. And actually had a guest on recently that talked about how open source should actually be considered critical infrastructure, how it's so pervasive in every area of our critical infrastructure these days. I was curious, as like, just someone that's been around the space for quite a while, do you think as nations, do we invest enough in the open source software ecosystem, given that we're relying on these commercial entities to, voluntarily put the money into, like Google and so on? And, how do we help these smaller companies who can't afford, Sneak and on, like the whole list of vendors to try to get that holistic picture, as you pointed out? Like, how do we get better at this as a society, honestly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good news about the SCA stuff is, like, if you go use OWASP dependency check, and I'm genuinely not biased about that. It's like as good as any of the commercial solutions, and it's free. So like that's a great thing. But in terms of like that, yeah, absolutely. Like, the Linux Foundation, OSSS, Open Source Security Foundation, like those things are very well funded. Like, there's hundreds of millions of dollars going through those things to do really good things. Like, they funded SigStore, they funded lots of other, things. Like when the original OpenSSL the thing happened before the Log4Shell thing, they went and gave that team $6 million to go figure out how to audit it. Like, and they raised that money really quickly. So there's huge impacts in having things like that. But I think it's kind of like, my analogy is it's kind of like climate, right? Like, we all know it's broken, like, unless you're one of these stupid climate denying people, but like, we all know it's broken, but like, do we all stop using less plastic? Like, and it's one of those things that it doesn't immediately affect your thing doesn't immediately affect everyone, but cumulatively it does. And so it's really hard to do that. And like these models, like there was a company called Tide Lift, I think they were called Tide Shift, who tried to get people to kind of contribute to important open source projects that they did, and it just fundamentally failed. Like, Like it basically became kind of like buy the developer a coffee kind of thing versus like no one's going to figure out how to commercially support it. And and that's the same with like everyone was slagging off OpenSSL last week or whenever it was, but like ultimately these are a bunch of people who for the most part doing this in their spare time, and everyone's critically relying on it and going, hey, what the hell happened? Like, well, if you were using it, like, what did you do to stop it happening, right? It's like, so I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough problem. The open source, the economics of open source are kind of a hard one to get your head around, right?
Yeah, I think you're pointing out, like, and the researcher I had on talked about this, like, a lot of the social and economic aspects is the nature of open source. We all have a bystander effect. We're all just standing around thinking someone else is going to address the problem or fix the issue. So I want to throw a little plug. You talked about OpenSSF. They had the open source security mobilization plan that they created. Yep. Folks definitely check that out. 10-point plan with 3 high-arching kind of areas.
I was involved in doing that. In fact, I led the SBOM part of that.
Oh, okay. It's funny to hear that, given your strong critiques of the state of SBOM at the moment.
Well, that's what we were trying to fix it, right? Like, so to get money to go fix it. So it was like,
definitely.
Right?
Yeah. So I wanted to move on from that a little bit. You talked about being the founder of OWASP. Anyone that's been in cyber, I've been in cyber almost 20 years. Everyone who's in cyber for some time is familiar with OWASP, use an OWASP project of some sort, read materials, learned from OWASP. I would love to hear a little bit of the origin story of that before I move on to the future of OWASP. Like, how the hell did that even come about?
Yeah, sure. So I was moderating a mailing list called it was called WebAppSec. It was part of there was BugTrack. Like, if you're as old as me, there used to be a big mailing list called BugTrack. And BugTrack was where kind of people would basically release funds, and responsible disclosure came out of all of that and stuff. And there was a side project called WebAppSec, and we had, I want to say, like 4,000 people on the mailing list or something like that. And I was the moderator, and I was running software security at Charles Schwab at the time. So Schwab was pretty progressive. Like, we had 8 million users, we had $1 trillion of assets sat in a mainframe in the back end, but we had high stakes stuff going on. And one day, so I was in charge of AppSec, and one day the CIO came running down the corridor going like, oh shit, like, we're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. We've got this vulnerability. And it was a cross-site scripting problem, and there were only 3 people that it affected. One was basically a guy trying to sell us a tool. The other one was his brother. And the third person was a journalist who got hold of this story. And honestly, it was like, okay, sure, it's real, but like, the reality is you can't actually do much with this thing. But these two guys, like the vendor and his brother, were basically just like spinning this thing up out of nowhere. But the problem that I had is, like, the CIO was like, well, point me to like the best practice. And like, it didn't exist. So he's like, well, okay, I trust you, like, we're paying you, but like, surely what these guys are saying is true as well. And so through the mailing list, I knew a bunch of really good people that I really trusted. And I reached out. A lot of them worked at banks and other things as well. And I reached out to them. They're like, yeah, this is just a fundamental problem. Like, we're getting the same crap that's happening. So I'm like, well, like, okay, let's just go put something on the internet. So literally one weekend, I went away and I wrote the first OWASP guide, literally in the weekend, like, hardly slept, and it's in a Word document. Like, it was, it wasn't fantastic, but then published it on the internet and just said on the mailing list, and like, hey, we're going to create this thing. It's called OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. The thing goes online. And literally, that was it. It kind of took off. It turned out a lot of people had the same problem. And then other people will come out with other problems like, hey, we need an architecture guide, or we need this, or whatever. And it was like, hey, just go do it without much thought. Like, we had a $20 hosting account on something. It was like, you have to push the content on FTP. Like, it was kind of funny. Actually, I think we used CVS as well as the version control at the time. But like, it was checking a Word doc into CVS, right? So it was like, so yeah, and that's kind of how it started. And then, before long, you got a lot of great people that were in there, David Endler and Steve Taylor and all of these sort of guys that were just kind of, creating great content, and it really took off from there. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story, and it's kind of like similar to open source. It's the power of the community, right? Like, that organization thrived because of
totally.
So I wanted to ask, you were obviously the founder of OWASP. Many of us know and are familiar with OWASP, but you've been on a strong campaign lately to get elected to the board of directors, as I understand it, of OWASP, and modernize it, as you say, to keep it relevant in the age of cloud native environments and DevOps and so on. So I'm curious to see, why do you think OWASP hasn't kept pace, and what do we need to do to keep OWASP, the industry, standard as it has been for so long?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I've always had this kind of like love-hate relationship with it. Hate's the wrong word, but like, I'm incredibly proud of it, right? And all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, when we first started it, it was like, how do you create education material for developers so you could go fix it? It never became that. Like, it became AppSec people who kind of, got involved, and a lot of AppSec consultants. And so, it kind of became a bit of an echo chamber. But that was fine. It was still producing great stuff. But over the years, what's happened is it's basically become bureaucratic, right? So there are committees for all sorts of things. And the bar to entry just became so low, and that was great. Like, everyone can participate, but the reality is, some people have less, trying to choose my word very carefully. Like, some people have less experience maybe, and maybe less skill. And as a result, like, some of the projects are really awful. Like, I just come out straight and say that, like, they are absolutely awful and shouldn't be projects. But because the bar is so low. And so what's happened over the years is kind of like, you got this mass, like, I think there's 700 projects that are in there. And so, they're all of varying quality. Like, if you have a developer coming there to get education, like, what does he do? Like, how does he know that this thing is the thing that he should be doing? And so this direction of it has become lost. There's this bureaucracy has come to the point where no one can make decisions. So like, there's a committee for this and a committee for that. And so, over the years, people just come to me and complain. And frankly, I was kind of like listening. And it's like, the shoulder to cry on. But it got to the point where a couple of things happened. Like, one is I was talking to a journalist, and she basically said to me, what happened to that project? Like, why did it die? And I was like, oh my God, like, I didn't realize it kind of died. But like, when people like that are basically saying it. And then when you watch other things like OSSF spring up and have such an amazing impact immediately, like, like I said, I'm lucky enough to get involved in the mobilization plan and all of these sort of things, and have a relationship with with Jim Zemlin and obviously Brian Bellendorf and these guys. Like, you think, oh my God, they're having such an impact, but OWASP should be having that impact. And it doesn't need to be competitive. Like, everyone should be able to raise the bar, but there are things that OWASP could be doing that they're not doing. And it should be, because there's a big following, there's a big brand, people trust it. And so, eventually got to the point of like, okay, well, I can have an impact on this. I can help fix this. And, there's a lot of things. Like, there's a bottoms up like funding model. So it's like, go pay $50 to go join it. Well, hundreds of millions of dollars goes through the other foundations. Well, like, great, let's go follow the same thing. Like, let's go call on Google and Microsoft and other people who have big grants like National Science Foundation and things, and GitHub, and like, hey, how can you guys support this? And what are the important projects that we can go tackle and go do on? So kind of what it really needs is leadership of like, look, these are the important things that we want to go do. Here's how we want to go and represent those things, and here's how we're going to go fund them. And so that's what I kind of ran on, and that's what I'm driving.
Yeah, I love it. And I agree. OWASP is such an industry, recognized organization. There's no reason that they shouldn't be in that group having that kind of an impact. So I know you just recently got elected to that, that board of directors. Just looking forward, I know there's a lot of things you probably want to tackle, but if you had to lay out, top 3 things in the next, say 90 days or 6 months, what are the top 3 things you plan to focus on?
Yeah. So one is we got to just completely dismantle the bureaucracy, right? Because without that, nothing's going to get done, right? And I totally get there's a lot of people with a vested interest in that not happening. I'm totally aware of it, right? There's conflicts of interest. There's people that are running, for instance, education committees who run education companies on the side. Like, it's not necessarily in their best interest to put great free education material on OWASP and things. So there's some hard conversations that need to happen, but we have to dismantle the bureaucracy in order to make decisions and going forward. And I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that if they're being honest with themselves. And I think that the people that are going to embrace that are actually going to benefit from it as well, because they're the people that are, like open source itself, like, it's if you're doing the right thing and you pay it forward, you'll get paid back. So as long as people embrace that. So that's kind of number one. Secondly, we've got to go fix the investment model, because if we want to tackle big projects, we've got to have the money to go do it. And so, if we're going to create great education and content material, we need to have the best people doing it. It can't be best efforts. Like, we need to go pay the best people to go create that. And we're going to need to pay developers to go build content that on a learning platform that allows that to happen. So with that, you need money. And the Linux Foundation and OSSF have proven that. Like if we want to go and have an impact on things. So like maybe, we decide, and the foundation have done this, like let's go mobilize, it's called Alpha Omega. Let's go mobilize developers to go fix problems. So like, great. Like why the hell did OWASP not do that? Like there's a bunch of people who write guidance and write this content. Let's go do it. And then the kind of third thing is like, we've got to figure out a lot of the content is just missing. Like it doesn't matter what you say. Java is not trendy, but it's probably one of the most widely used languages for financial services applications and things that are really important. Well, guess what? There's no Java security guidance at OWASP. Like it hasn't been touched in years and years. Like those things are just massive gaps. Like, OWASP doesn't have a credible code review tool. Like SAST is one of the most obvious tools that's widely accepted, but there is nothing at OWASP that does it properly. There are some toy projects there, but there's nothing that's really good. And so again, we can partner with SemGreps and CodeQL and underlying technologies and build rules and build things and provide guidance. But these are really important things that we need to go tackle. Like what we don't need is another Hackney Bank or another, vulnerable PHP application or whatever the thing is. Like it is done to death, but we need to go focus on the important things. So first we've got to remove the bureaucracy to get stuff done. Then we've got to get the money in. And then then we got to pinpoint where are the important projects that we need to go deploy those resources and deploy that money and go make an impact. Training is one obvious one because, when you can educate people, you can go scale, but tooling is probably one of the others. There are some amazing projects. Like Zap is one of the top 1,000 projects on GitHub. Cyclone DX should be. It's like I said, it's commercial quality, SCA. You've got ASVS, like the Application Security Verification Standard, which is like referenced by, all sorts of people around the world. And top 10s have been incredibly successful. That was Jeff Williams, kind of baby child. But like there are, top 10s for certain things, Kubernetes and other things. But like there should be one for, all of the important things. Like if I come to there, what's the top 10 things I should know about Kubernetes? What's the top 10 things I should know about, deploying cloud native apps and or using, certain things. And so we need to make sure that like each of the pieces that are important that we want to tie it to is properly funded, properly successful, and we've got it there.
Yeah,
the website. I'm sorry to cut you off. The other thing is like the website's an absolute mess. Like you go there, you got no clue how to navigate it. Like I've done it. I've sat down with developers and went like, okay, you turn up here first, like what happens? And so the website is basically insular focused. It's focused on the people in OWASP, not focused on solving the problem to the people that don't know it. So I've already got a firm who are great called NetGuru, and they've basically donated. They've put a UX person, a user experience person on this, who's looking at the site and basically saying, okay, these are tactical things that you can just fix, but like, what do we actually want to do? Like, these are the people that want to go through. What are they trying to go and achieve? How do we position everything in the way that they can go do it? So, instead of rocking up to a projects page that's listed A to Z and you've got no clue what any of them do, it's like, great, what are you here to go and achieve? Oh, I'm looking for a tool to go do this. I'm a Java developer. Great. Here are the ones that are there. So that one's already underway with those guys as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I've had several guests on the show. Jimmy Mesta, who was involved in the Kubernetes Top 10. I've had Steve Springett on, obviously ASVS and Cyclone DX and so on. And I've used Cyclone DX, or I should say OWASP resources for a long time. So I'm really excited that you're coming in here, shaking things up and going to make it, a relevant organization, as you say, again, moving into the future. So one question we ask every guest before we let them go is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you?
What does it mean to me? I think, stuff should be, in my opinion, like this whole thing of like secure software is like, it needs to be secure enough. And like, that's the reality. So for me, resilience is like that. It's like, is this thing resilient enough to be used in the way that it was meant to be used? And so that's I think that's my kind of take. I think it's a great word. And I think, is it fit for purpose, I guess? And I think that's the key. That's the key with all of this stuff. Like building secure software is not the goal. It's like, is building software that's secure enough the goal, right?
Yeah, makes sense. I love it. Short and sweet. So for folks that want to follow you along, follow what you're up to with OWASP and so on, where can they find you? Where should folks find you and follow you?
Yeah, so we're posting on the Twitter handle CrashAppSec, which is where a lot of the personal content is going. But honestly, like these days, who knows what's going to happen with Twitter? So I'm actually moving back to a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. So go to just Google Curphey on LinkedIn, and John created SAM, which is the project. So John was the original author of that, which is CLASP, which became that. So John's also on LinkedIn, Viega, Viega. So yeah, follow that content, and then of course there'll be stuff on the OWASP channels and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to chat today. You're an absolute, as someone said it in the chat here, a legend in the industry, and look forward to seeing what you do with OWASP. And I'm glad you're involved in things like OpenSSF's, a mobilization plan and so on. Really excited to have you on, and I really appreciate it.
No, that's great. English sense of humor is that a legend is a legend. So not necessarily the best the best acronym, but hey, if you can't have humor, what else? Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Take care, and take care, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.